What is going on, guys? It's Bucky with Tryways and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to help and give you guys some tips on how to catch big redfish using Berkley Gulps here. I am located here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and some of my favorite fish to target and catch is big redfish, especially back in some of these local inshore inlets, back in the flats and the grass beds. And some of my favorite bait to use is these Berkley Gulps. This is a sea mullet here. This has been a go-to of mine. I've fished this a lot. I also use like a minnow or a shrimp or a jerk shad, but this is one of my favorites. This video, I'm gonna really give you guys a couple tips on what to use, how to use these Berkley Gulps efficiently and catch big redfish. Tip number one is tying up and using the right hook. So if I am fishing a lot more inshore on flats or grass beds like behind me here, I'm gonna use a much smaller and lighter jig, which this is an 1/8 ounce jig. The reason why is I wanna have a lot of freedom of movement with this jig. When I'm throwing right up against these grass beds, there's a lot of structure, there's a lot of oyster beds or rocks. I wanna be able to jig that quick. I wanna be able to get it out and obviously catch the fish's attention with that. If I'm fishing docks or bridges or somewhere where there's a lot of current, I wanna use a bigger jig. That's a 1/2 ounce jig there. It'll help me be able to work that jig and that bait in the current more. Any kind of structure I'm around, it gives me a little weight. Or even if I'm fishing out in the bay for redfish, obviously this will help me get down kind of into the points where I want to fish. So it's really not too hard putting a gulp on the jig head. You'll see it's got kind of a flat surface on the top of the gulp itself. You're going to run the tip of the hook on there like this. You're going to push the body of the gulp up, and then it's going to start rotating on that hook. You're going to run the tip of that, that gulp up like that, and then you want to make sure that you pull the gulp above the shank of that hook all the way up to the jig head like so. And like I said, you want that to look as natural as possible. You have that tail that's swimming through the water, it's parallel, the tail's not up or down, and make it look as natural as possible. Tip 2, know where to target redfish and knowing your water conditions. So this really is probably the most important tip and part of this video. First off, it's really critical to know where redfish like to eat and where they feel most comfortable. Reds are really notorious and known for loving structure, and this is where they like to eat. This is where they feel comfortable at. So knowing where to target is very important. A lot of some common examples for structure is docks, pylons, bridges, or even behind me on some of these flats and grass beds, even if it's oysters or unlevel ground, up at the grass beds themselves. Drum love hiding in these spots, targeting small bait fish. It's where they feel the most comfortable. Second part of this tip is knowing your water conditions. Saltwater is so different than freshwater, where you constantly have changing water. It can be a low tide up to a high tide, high tide down to a low tide. So knowing your conditions is really important. One of my personal favorite times to fish for redfish is normally at a low tide coming up to a high tide. It's when they're in deeper waters. They're getting more hungry. The bait fish are starting to come feed up on the flats and on the grass beds, which causes those redfish to be a lot more aggressive. But again, there's no right or wrong way necessarily on an outgoing tide or incoming tide, but I'm going to give you guys a couple tips on what to look for on each change of tide. All right, so if you're out in the water during a low tide or close to a slack tide, your bait fish and your drum are going to start coming out to deeper water. Obviously, they're not feeding up in the grass beds and the flats. You got a low tide. So during this time, they like to go out to a lot of points or drop-offs is where the redfish will stay. Some of your bait fish will come out there and where they'll strike. So when I'm fishing around a low tide, I'm going to be looking on the depth finder. I'm going to look out for a lot of drop-offs. I'm going to look for these points. And I'm going to cast out there, and I'm going to try to get that jig and that gulp into deeper water with a slower jig or with a slower reel and a couple of jigs here and there. But I know the fish are going out to deeper water. They're waiting for that water to change, waiting for that tide. They're going to be in a lot of those drop-offs and circling and schooled up around some of those points. Step 3, jigging techniques. Now every angler, every fisherman jigs or reels in their bait a little differently, and there's no exact science or perfect way. So again, kind of like the type of jig head that I'm using is going to depend on how quick I'm reeling in or jigging for these redfish. On a lot of these grass beds like this, if I'm using a lighter weight, I'm gonna be reeling a lot faster. I'm gonna be doing probably more quicker movements of the jig, catching that fish's eye. If I'm in deeper water or around structure, I'm probably gonna be using a heavier weight and probably gonna be a slower reel in with a couple small jigs, but I want that that hook and that bait to kind of sit in that water because that current's gonna be moving it. So I will not be jigging it or reeling it as fast. Tip 4, knowing a redfish bite and when to set that hook. So redfish are one of my favorite fish for probably the biggest reason is when you set the hook and fight a redfish. They are so much fun to catch. And redfish are a lot different than some maybe of your fish inshore like flounder or trout, or maybe those guys are gonna be kind of picking at it, playing with it, and you're waiting to set it. Redfish are historically really known to come up, strike with a big thud on that gulp. You'll feel a big hit and set it right then. Most of the time, they're not gonna come up and play with it and kind of pick around with it. They're gonna come up, eat it, they're gonna run with it, set it, and then you'll know you're probably on a red. Tip 5, get rid of tailbiters. So what we call tailbiters is a lot of the little fish that like to follow your gulp in and constantly just tap and bite at the tail itself. And a lot of us who fish with these gulps know that these are rubber, they're not the most durable, so with any kind of little bites, with any fish with teeth, unfortunately you lose the tail. And these are not cheap, these are like $20 a piece, and they'll last you a little bit if you can avoid the tail biters. So if you're getting a lot of those constant little thuds, those little hits while you're reeling in, I'd recommend reel in another 3, 4, 5 feet, try to get away from them. If they're still hitting it, come reel it back in, recast somewhere else, or maybe relocate. But if you're getting a lot of those little taps like that, 99% of the time, it's not gonna be a drum. If it's a drum, you're gonna feel a big thud or a big strike. So to save some money and to catch redfish, avoid the tail biters. These are cheap. Tip 6, and the final step here, is when to change your bait. So if you're fishing in some like grass beds in the flats behind me, if you're out here 10, 15, 20 minutes and you're not catching anything, doesn't necessarily mean that maybe you're throwing the wrong bait. Maybe it means you're not on the fish, or you might have a slack tide where you need some water conditions to change and you need more movement. So, you know, give it some time. If you're out here maybe an hour or two, I'd probably change up and maybe go through like an artificial shrimp or a jerk shad, like a long-tailed minnow. But you know, give it some time, see what the fish like. If you're getting any hits, then you can change it up. But something I would definitely recommend that I do a lot is these containers hold this liquid, which is like a scent to make this these mullet smell like a natural bait fish, if you will. So a lot of times what I'll do is I will take the cap off here and I'll set it up at the front of the boat. If I'm using this mullet and I still have the tail after 10, 15 minutes, sometimes I'll dump it in here, kind of get a recharge, reset, get it back out there and see if you can get on some fish. All right guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope this gave you a couple tips on how to catch big redfish using the Berkley Gulps here. If you're not already subscribed to Tryways, make sure you hit that button, hit that bell button so you guys are notified of all future content videos coming out. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys on the water.